welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and our guest today is...
Yes, hi, it's nice to be here. My name is Olga Grushin. I'm a novelist, and I'm introducing The Charmed Wife, which is my fourth novel.
It was very cool because it was the most interesting and original take on a Cinderella story that I think I've ever read.
Oh, I thank you for saying that.
Cinderella stories, and it is, for our listeners, it is a twist on the Cinderella story, as you might have guessed, because I pretty much just said that. But they're perennial favorites. You've had so many retellings of, I guess, Germanic Cinderella. And then there's every culture has its own type of Cinderella story. There's a lot of love for the story of, a simple young girl who's abused and then comes up and becomes the queen. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
absolutely. And, fairy tales in general, there's a lot of that. But what I loved about your story was that it brought it to places that I've never seen before. So why don't you tell us, in your own words, the plot of the story without giving too much away, and where you came up with this idea?
Yes, so it starts off as a Cinderella retelling, but as you mentioned, it goes in very different directions. It opens up and takes you to places that are different from where it started. So it's not a traditional retelling, it's more of a mix of fantasy and realism genres, really. But at the beginning of the story, Cinderella has been married for 13 and a half years. She has two children. Her Prince Charming is no longer that charming in her eyes. She's very unhappy. So at the very start of the book, she sneaks out of the palace in the middle of the night to go and meet with a powerful witch at the crossroads. And the witch usually sells love potions to disgruntled housewives. But in this case, Cinderella does not ask for a love potion. She wants her husband dead. So that's the premise, that's the start. And then later on, we see what went wrong in her marriage. But the story also goes forward. And as it goes forward, it really opens up. And so you will have talking mice on the one hand. And yes, I don't want to spoil too much, but you will also have talk of divorce proceedings and custody arrangements. So it takes you to very modern places. And so readers should expect that it's not a traditional retelling. I think, sometimes people come to this book with a kind of a young adult-ish expectation of a traditional fairy tale retelling, and there are a lot of them out there, and some of them are more subversive, some of them are less so. But this one really is kind of in between genres and a blend. And I came up with the idea in a very organic fashion. I love fairy tales myself, and I
Me
read
too.
them. Yeah, no, everybody does, of course. They're such a huge part of our childhood. So I read fairy tales as a child. And I love the traditional ones. I love the princess and the princesses and the happy endings. But then when I started reading them to my own daughter when she was little, she hated them.
Really?
She did. She hated the
Whoa.
princess. She hated the princesses. It made me realize, maybe she is different, but maybe it's her generation. Maybe young girls growing up right now, they're looking for different types of stories because she was so bored, and she liked the more gruesome stories, I must say, of the Brothers Grimm. And there are a lot of them.
There are some good ones.
There were some really gruesome ones, but she did not like your traditional romantic, fluffy prince marries princess. She said, princesses are boring. I don't want to hear more about them. And who needs princes? And as it happened, I was actually going through a divorce at the time. So it was the combination of her reaction, which did surprise me, and my own personal life at the time that made me look at these happily ever after stories. And I must say, there's nothing autobiographical in The Charmed Wife. I never
good.
attempted to curse my ex-husband at a crossroads.
Oh,
And
I didn't even think to ask you that, but thank you, because I'm
no,
sure listeners would wonder, be like, "Ooh, did she like find?" Yeah.
no. There's nothing autobiographical in the ways that her marriage went wrong either. Mine was very boring. Wouldn't make a story of any sort.
And why did you decide that in a fairy tale to bring divorce into it?
Well, so again, this was my way of looking at the happily ever after and trying to say that couplings are not always the logical conclusion to a narrative and are not always the desirable conclusion to a narrative. And in my own life, was again nothing like the divorce and the marriage in the story, and civil. There's nothing of my ex-husband in the story, as I told him, don't worry, nothing there to trouble you. But there was this stake when I was getting divorced or I was single. People look at single women in a certain way. They look at them with pity almost, and they assume that it's not by their own volition that they're single or divorced. There was almost this sometimes even spoken, sometimes unspoken reaction when I would tell people that I'm divorced or that I'm single. Oh, you poor thing, or oh, it's his loss. That kind of take on things, which surprised me because I did not expect it. Because I feel that there shouldn't be this reaction. That is not a reaction to a single man, for example. Not to go or gender equality here, but when a man says he's not married, nobody says, "Oh, you poor thing. Oh, it's her loss." Just think about it for a second. That would be a ridiculous reaction. So why do women get this reaction? And I myself felt that for me it was a very exciting new chapter, and I loved being in control of my own life, and it was something very positive. um, and I wanted to put that in the book a little bit. There are certain limits within the fantasy setting to an extent, but that was one of the impulses that prompted this, that the way we see uncoupled women, if you will, is very different from the way I think they should be seen.
Yeah.
I think that princess and coupling should be over, and that we should tell different narratives, that there is an excitement to being in charge of your own life. And so that went into the book. But the impulse came from the combination of my daughter's reaction to fairy tales and my own circumstances. And I started looking at all these stories, and I felt there's such a need for a different type of narrative, because we still tell these tired stories of princess rescuing maidens, and the world has changed so much. And I think there was really a kind of an urge to explore all these different takes on women and different stories. Lots of other stories come in. It starts off as just the Cinderella narrative, but later on you have Sleeping Beauty and 12 Dancing Princesses and Bluebeard, all these other stories, Rapunzel. And so I just wanted to kind of look at different paths that are open to women today, and sort of how it's seen in terms of these fairy tale metaphors almost.
Yeah, it worked beautifully. I want to talk so much more about the nuances in it, but I really urge readers to read it, or obviously if you prefer audiobooks. Is it available in audiobook as well?
Yes.
Yeah, or listen to it if that's more of your thing, because I'm reading it and I'm like, and it starts off like different, like Cinderella adaptations, you'll be enjoying it, and then you'll be like, okay, I recognize this, I recognize that. When Cinderella's retelling, talking to the witch about why she's come to this decision, but then it gets to a point where you're just like, oh, and it's like, it's almost like you've been like sitting on a train with the curtains drawn and you haven't seen anything, you just assume there's, whatever terrain going past you, and then you pull up the curtains and you see everything for what it was that you've been missing, and you're like, oh, okay, and it's great. Yeah, I do look a lot, because Disney princesses, I haven't worked in the children's department full time in a few years, but they were still very popular when I had. But there also were a lot of people looking for empowered stories. And I know the Disney company itself has really sort of moved on from that, tried to give their princesses agency, with like the Tangled Rapunzel, or obviously, they're telling more diverse stories like Moana. I grew up with Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. I remember there was a point where I felt like all of a sudden I'm like, man, Cinderella, professional victim.
Yes. But even the new stories like Rapunzel, yes, they're done in a different way, more modern, of course, and the princesses are more active and they have more personality,
Right.
but they still end with a happy coupling.
Yes, that is true.
Some do not. Brave.
Moana doesn't. Moana is just
Moana-
friends with Maui, but
Yeah.
Rapunzel and Flynn Rider, Eugene Fitzherbert, I think was his real name. They do end up married at the end.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is that. Actually, Rapunzel itself is an interesting story. There is a lot of subversive type of interpretation of the original stories.
Oh, yes.
And Rapunzel itself is one of the more interesting ones because there is another narrative that Rapunzel was actually
pregnant, right?
No, not just pregnant, but that she was in a couple with a witch. That was one of the interpretations because, of course, she lived with a witch. And so I played a little bit on that in my take on Rapunzel because I've read so much fairy tale theory and there is a lot of the subtext in even the original stories, Brothers Grimm, that you can read into, and that's one of the possible interpretations, something between the lines, if you will, that's not obvious in the story, but it is obvious that the witch does love her and she gets distressed when she leaves, and so there is more to it possibly than what we see. Yeah,
that's very interesting, because I do know, from reading different versions of Rapunzel, obviously the more sanitized ones, Rapunzel slips something to the effect of "you're much later than my prince," is how the witch finds out that she's been
meeting with someone.
Yeah,
you're right.
But there's another one where she notices that her dress is getting too tight.
Exactly, and
but that's very interesting because that's the first time that I've heard that, and I love fairy tale theory, so that's fascinating. I think you reference a lot of other fairy tales, and I did like what you did with the Rapunzel story, by the way. That was beautiful. I think you referenced like Princess Furball, I think.
Yes,
was that what it's called?
There are a lot of them, and of course, there is Little Red Riding Hood and Beauty and the Beast that come in.
And the little old lady who lived in a shoe, but she wasn't so old in this version.
No, not in that one. Well, she has a lot of children, so she can't possibly, they call people over 35 old. So.
Oh, totally. If you're, seriously, you're 4 and 20. Why aren't you married? That was so cool. So the mice. How did you decide to give the voice to the mice? There's a lot of stories going on within this, but there's other narration going on with Cinderella's mice, because as we know, at least from like Disney and what Cinderella, she talks to her mice, and she's got they're her I'm going to edit that, faithful friends who they become morphed into other animals for her benefit and are always behind her. How did you come up with their story?
Yes, so there is a parallel sort of narrative running. They're separate episodes, but they are connected. And I felt like Cinderella, even my version of the story, is still a romance-focused story. I felt like I needed some counterpart because in the main story, all these humans, Cinderella and her prince, they're waltzing, they're obsessing over their love interests. And it almost felt like a upstairs, downstairs sort of a component to the story, where there are these mice who are having really different types of experiences. There are wars, there are revolutions, there are cultural upheavals. It starts off small with just the two mice friends that Cinderella has originally, not quite the Gus Gus or whatever it's called in the Disney version.
Yes.
Mine are called Brie and Nibbles. And then, in a kind of a twist, they, of course, don't live that long, as mice don't. So they go through many generations in the story. They die, but not to distress the princess. Early on, they make a decision to keep passing on the original name. So she's oblivious to the fact that these are continuously new mice. That are still called Brie and Nibbles, but in reality, they're, Brie and Nibbles the third, the fourth, and so on. And then different things happen and it branches off in wider directions. So to me, it really was kind of the little people, their lives, there are social concerns there are the poor, there are, of course, the revolutions, and then this sort of upstairs world of very different kinds of really shallow concerns. And so, and also in addition, there is a plot dimension to this. I've heard that some people find the story charming, but a little irrelevant to the story, or some said that you should really write a book focused just on the mice, but they are intertwined. You just have to look closely, because I did not want to spell out everything. There are a lot of sort of Easter eggs in the book, and there are a lot of secret connections between the different characters that come into view if you read closely. And again, that's not something that I want to hit the reader over the head with, but it is there. And you can read the main plot line in very different ways. There is a more mundane interpretation and there is a magical interpretation, and the magical interpretation is hidden in the mice story. So in one of the components to the mice narrative, there is a possible way of seeing the book in a very different light. So there is that. And I should also mention that the mice actually are one autobiographical bit in this whole book.
Ooh.
Just the mice, nothing else. But we did have two baby mice that we found in our basement. They were Brie and Nibbles, we called them, with my kids. But in the night, one of them died. I really tried so hard, but they were tiny little blind mice, and I didn't know what to do with them. And I read all the stuff on the internet, and I tried to feed them with the eyedropper with some milk and peanut butter. One of them died in the night, and I was so upset how I would tell the kids, because the kids were really into the mice, and this happened at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then I went downstairs and just happened to find another baby mouse. I don't know if there was a nest that had been disturbed or something, and then I tried to pass this mouse as another nibble. So I'm like, hey, three nibbles. My kids were more observant than Cinderella, and they said, no, this is not the same mouse.
That's like the goldfish thing that a lot of parents do.
Exactly.
When they notice that the goldfish is belly up, and while the kid is at school, they run out to Petco and get another goldfish, and the kid is either like, oh yeah, that's totally the same goldfish, or the kid's like, no, I don't think that goldfish had as much white on that side. So yeah.
Goldfish, so I'm familiar with that. Yeah, so that's sort of where that idea came from, that I would keep replacing the mice, and then of course it opened itself to many other stories that I wanted to tell about them.
So you brought a lot of character to the Wicked Stepsisters. Wicked Stepsisters, I think that that's a trope that a lot of people attribute to their own lives. I mean, clearly in most interpretations of Cinderella, the Wicked Stepsisters are pretty awful.
Yes.
I know and I've said this so many times, either in the podcast or events, that my favorite growing up when I was a young adult, early 20s, there was a Cinderella version with Drew Barrymore. And one of the stepsisters was, called Ever After. One of the stepsisters was not as awful as the other. But then Angelica Houston was like the worst stepmother. She was terrible. I think that there's been just sort of a lot of kind of look at the idea of, blended families. And not even just blended families, but birth order, and just sort of how complicated sibling relationships are. Did you find it difficult to sort of connect those threads, or did you have a definite idea of where you wanted to be with it?
No, I had an idea. In a way, Cinderella herself is a bit of a blank, and that's intentional
Yeah.
for several reasons. One is that, of course, protagonists in fairy tales as we know them are often rather blank. And even in stories like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, we never really get told that they're in love. It's more of a story of sometimes revenge, as in the original story of Cinderella, where both sisters end up being blinded, and it's a very dark story. Or in Sleeping Beauty, which in the original is also quite dark. It's another revenge story. But they are rather blank. We don't get to hear about their emotions. We don't really know much about them. And so it's a little harder to pull off in a novel. And but that was intentional, that she would start off being sort of this idea of a sweet Disney-like, almost cotton candy wrapped in her pink or blue dress, kind of floating through life, but then getting all these real things happen to her and getting real emotions thrown in at her. Whereas the other characters in the story start out a bit cartoonish, intentionally so. Also, there is the witch with her warts, and there is the fairy godmother with her
Who we have
fussing.
not even touched upon, but
Yeah.
she was great.
I would say true. And then, of course, there are her two sisters, who she just mentions in passing in the original version of a story that she tells her children. But then those are the characters, the side characters, that end up being more real and with real backstories. And in a way, it's almost like different paths of um, potential life choices, of women's choices that are open to her. And as she goes through the story, she gets more and more real. She does rediscover her relationship with her sisters. I myself do not have sisters, so that was not part of um, the story at all. But it was interesting to play with that, but different the two were.
I don't have sisters either, but my mother has two sisters, and I very much appreciated the narrative because I did find it very authentic.
Thank you. Yeah, nobody in my family has any sisters, so that was except for my son, who I have a daughter and a son. So
Yes, just like Cinderella has a daughter
just
and a
like
son.
Cinderella,
Yes.
yes. So there's, it's just something familiar. But the children in the story, again, at one point, I even mentioned something that there are these, blank children who are conveniently shifted around a story just for plot convenience. They become more real in Cinderella's mind as the story goes on. In fact, that's one of the movers of the story, but we don't really know much about them. They're sort of ideas in her mind more than anything else until the end, really.
Right, right, right. So, what are you working on now?
So I'm writing a very different kind of book. In general, this is my fourth novel, so I'm writing a fifth one now. All my books are very different, and I don't think I'll ever write the same story again. It's usually every book is something I live with for 2-3 years, so it's important to me to have something very different to think about. This one is dark and dystopian, I'm afraid, as if we need more of that right now.
Don't be afraid. I love those books.
Yeah, but it doesn't really have fairy tale elements. In fact, I feel like this one was a bit of a one-off for me, a departure, because um, again, it's an adult retelling, but it does have more of a fantasy element to it than my previous novels. So they all had a bit of magic realism in them. And this one does too, but it doesn't have anything to do with fairy tales. And I don't want to say more because I've done this before, where I describe the book in progress, and then right after that, something happens and I toss it out and I start a completely new book. So I'm not going to jinx it this time. I've had a
No,
couple.
that's cool. I just will hope that you'd be willing to come on and talk to us about it when it's released.
Yeah, I think thank you so much. I would love to. And I think it will be of some relevance because it does have to do, I'll just say that it has to do with books and libraries in a way.
Oh, of course. Librarians love reading books about libraries and books and librarians. It's always fun to get that meta. um, so before we go, what are some of your favorite Grimm's fairy tales? And they, or not Grimm's fairy tales, and they don't have to be mainstream because I'm super curious myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so nowadays it's very different. I read more of kind of modern takes on stories. Some of my favorites are, of course, Angela Carter, The Bloody Chamber, which are retellings of the original stories. There's Bluebeard and Little Red Riding Hood. They are amazing. So for those who don't know it, I really, really recommend her book. It's just marvelous. It's beautifully told, but also they are just the right kind of subversive. There's this amazing story of Little Red Riding Hood where one of my favorite lines in the book is she was nobody's meat. They turn out very differently and they're just wonderful. There's Emma Donoghue, also another book of modern takes on these classic stories. And in fact, there I believe Cinderella falls in love with the fairy godmother. So there's that take, and I like those very much. But of the original stories, there are so many of them, and there are some even told by the traditional storytellers that are departures from this happily ever after and that are therefore not as well known. Like in Charles Perrault original collection, there is a story of Ricky the Tuft. I don't know if you know it, but it was in
No.
the original. Yes, because it ends in a way that is sort of distressing to this whole paradigm of happily ever after. And it's a story of an ugly princess. I mean, sorry, a beautiful princess and an ugly prince. The prince is very smart and she's very stupid, but she's very beautiful and he's very ugly, and they're neighbors. And it's a story of how they gradually fall in love. And it ends with, and when she agreed to marry him, he became handsome. But then there is this very kind of disturbing line at the end, but maybe he really didn't. He remained ugly, but because she saw him as a human being, in her eyes, he really was handsome now. So when I read it as a 7-year-old, I thought, what kind of an ending is that? But now I appreciate it. And that's in the original collection. It's right there next to the original Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. But see, even you've never heard of it for a good reason, because nobody wants to see that kind of ending that throws the happily ever after with a handsome prince up in the air. And that's what happens there. So there are a lot of these gems in the original collections that I really like. There's some wonderful 17th century French tales also that are different. Madame d'Aulnay is another collection. So lots to discover.
I'm always I'm a fan of I mean, I mentioned Princess Furball. I think that one's pretty good.
Yes.
There's a really interesting one that's like, it's more like male centric, I guess. What is it, like with the bear skin, where he makes
Oh,
like a
yes.
deal with the devil that he can, like, he'll be rich if he doesn't wash himself, and he just walks around with this bear skin
Mm-hmm.
forever, and then eventually he ends up besting the devil, and I think marrying a princess. I can't remember exactly, but that one was always interesting to me because it was like reversal. 12 Dancing Princesses
That one is great.
is
And
very good.
it is great. It is actually a part of my book too. I used that one.
Yes, you did. Yes.
Yes, it's a fascinating story um, that basically has to do with women trying to be independent and do their own thing and being thwarted by the men in their lives. There's their father figure and there is the man who pursues them, and I play with that in the story as well. So there are a lot of these stories, and what I really like is taking one of the famous stories like Cinderella and then discovering different versions. There's some really excellent books that trace all the different versions of Cinderella, and the farther back you go, the more outlandish and original and unique they get. In fact, the very first version is Chinese.
Is that the one with the fish, where
Mm-hmm.
the fish grants her
There's the
the
fish.
wishes? Yes,
There's
that's a very good one.
Yeah, so it's all of these stories, there's so many layers to them. What I like is kind of rediscovering these different angles. I think it was Neil Gaiman who said that the fairy tales are, I don't remember how exactly he put it, but the idea was that they are best for their retellings, and that they
Yeah.
gain their importance in their retelling. And that's what I feel. There are these basic archetypes that we're all drawn to and we will be drawn to, but what makes it unique is that every new period, every new age, every new generation looks at a different angle. And so this was my attempt in this book to kind of turn this idea of the universal coupling that's present in all these stories upside down and to look at it from a different angle. So kind of in a grown up, not always very fantasy like version.
Well, yeah, I think like there's a lot of unrealistic standards that are built in, when you're a young child and this is what you're consuming and I mean, I know that you say it's supposed to be fantasy and not real, but it's very difficult for, I think, especially since it's everywhere, not to internalize it. And, imagine that a marriage is happily ever after, that, even good marriages have their quarrels and have like hardships. Like happily ever after is, I don't, it's kind of harmful to say because it implies that any bump is not a happy, is not in line with happily ever after. And really, it's work, and that's not bad. And sometimes the work, leads to a continuation and you're able to come together and make it work. And sometimes it doesn't. And then when that happens, it blows everything up. So I do think that these interpretations and like a examination of happily ever after is really important. So thank you for putting it in your book.
Well, of course. And, one more thing I will say that in so many of the even subversive versions where the stories are presented from a different angle, there's still a coupling at the end, even if the protagonist, often newly divorced in the kind of chick lit-ish realistic books or what have you, a story starts in a place where something has gone wrong, she's unhappy, but then you expect in a certain kind of book that she will then meet someone else. There will be, some, thoughtful, I don't know, barista or a librarian or, someone who's not like her husband. And then they'll be off to a new story. This happens always. And I wanted to subvert these expectations.
That's true. It doesn't always have to end in a coupling.
And I think I write darkish books in general. And if you look at my previous books, they are what is, I guess, called strictly literary fiction, although I'm a bit uneasy about this term, but they are somewhat dark. And this particular book has its dark moments, of course. It's in many ways a dark take on the fantasy, but I felt also that this particular book was a lot more uplifting than my other books, and it has this message of hope. And that also ran parallel a little bit with my life, because as I was finding my way into what I felt was a new narrative, I felt this sense of tremendous excitement that you kind of escape from this familiar paradigm, and now you're in charge of your own life and you can make your own rules. And there was this wonderful sense of my life being unpredictable and opening up, and I wanted to put that in the book and play with that. And so to me, yes, even though I subvert these familiar ideas, it's still a very hopeful book. Now, of course, I write all these books so that they can be up to the reader to interpret. And I love writing stories that are ambiguous or that have many different layers, and you can read it however you wish. And so if people want to see this ending as more happy, less happy, it's up to them. But my feeling as I was writing it was one of this kind of energized excitement and looking at all these old stories and finding a new path between them, sort of.
My feeling at the end of the book, without giving too much away, is that it was like standing on the mountain and taking a fresh breath of air.
Oh, it's so wonderful to hear you say that. Yeah, I mean, that was sort of, that's a wonderful way of putting it. Yes, opening up is how I would describe it. There's a sense of just these branching off possibilities and different paths.
Excitement and also a little bit of fear, but, like knowing that you took a step and just sort of looking at a path around you and opportunity.
Yes. And I think, another thing that I want to say is that I think people who will come to this book expecting strictly a fantasy story may not see it quite that way and may find it jolting or unsettling. So I hope that the readers who do pick it up will have an open mind, because it does go in very different directions. It is not a traditional retelling. So it kind of plays with what you expect and throws it all out the window. So just so they know, I'm warning them. There'll be upsetting moments, perhaps.
Thank you so much. So once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries podcast and
Olga Grushin.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.